welcome to History House. I'm your host, Owen Delaney. Let's begin. On the 13th of September, 1847, 30 men stood waiting to be executed in Mixcoac, Mexico City. They had been former soldiers of the US Army and were found guilty of desertion. As they awaited their fate, US soldiers were battling Mexican troops for control of Chapultepec Castle, an important fortress overlooking the Mexican capital. Eventually, the US flag was raised over the citadel at 9:30 a.m., which was taken as the signal to execute these men. The wagons that these deserters were standing on were pulled away, and they were hanged. These men were members of El Battalion de San Patricio, the St. Patrick's Battalion, or Los San Patricios for short, a unit of mainly Irish Catholic men, but also Germans, Canadians, English, French, Italians and others, who had deserted the US Army on account of anti-Irish and anti-Catholic discrimination, and served the Mexican Army at battles such as Monterrey, Buena Vista and Churubusco. Theirs is a complicated legacy. On the one hand, they are remembered primarily as traitors in the United States, on account of their desertion, but as heroes, martyrs even, in Mexico, defending the country as it came under attack from its northern neighbour. This episode will attempt to separate fact from fiction to tell the story of these men, while also providing background to Mexico and the wider war itself. So, without any further ado, let's go. Eraiglen, vamos. In 1821, the Viceroy of New Spain, Juan O'Donoghue, a Spanish officer of Irish descent, signed the Treaty of Cordoba, recognising Mexican independence and ending a war that had begun in 1810 with the Grito de Dolores by Father Miguel Hidalgo. While now independent, Mexico was by no means stable, as questions about its form of government spilled into fighting, struggles for power emerged between conservatives and liberals, and settlers from the US settled in the territory of Texas, threatening Mexican control of the province. Agustin de Iturbide was proclaimed Emperor Augustine I in 1822, but was forced to abdicate by March 1823 due to growing opposition, and he was later executed. In 1824, Mexico adopted a federal constitution modelled after that of the United States. However, the period after this was marked by a violent tug-of-war between liberals, federalists, and conservatives, centralists, for power. At the same time, the Mexican government was eager to populate and secure its northern frontier, and so they invited Anglo-American settlers into Texas. Stephen F. Austin led the first families into the region under specific conditions. They had to become Mexican citizens, obey Mexican laws, and had to profess the Catholic faith. By 1835, approximately 30,000 Anglo-colonists lived in Texas, far outnumbering the 8,000 Mexican residents. Tensions would increase over time due to a number of factors. Mexico abolished slavery in 1829, a law many Anglo settlers, particularly cotton plantation owners from the US South, ignored. In addition to this, General Antonio López de Santa Anna repealed the liberal 1824 Constitution in 1835 and established a centralized government in Mexico City, which would serve as the catalyst for the Texas Rebellion. Following defeats at the Alamo and Goliad, Texas forces under Sam Houston defeated and captured Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto in 1836. While Santa Anna signed treaties recognizing Texas's independence in exchange for his release, the Mexican Congress declared these agreements null and void, refusing to recognize the Lone Star Republic. Mexico, however, was not in a position to take back control of Texas. In 1838, France invaded in the Pastry War to settle claims for property damage, and revolt broke out in the Yucatan and elsewhere, with the national treasury bordering on bankruptcy. Additionally, there were border disputes between Mexico and the Texas Republic, with Texas claiming that its southern border was the Rio Grande, while Mexico maintained the traditional colonial boundary was the Nueces River, further north. While not something that threatened Mexican sovereignty, the dispute took a new dimension when the US formally annexed Texas in December 1845 as part of the ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that the US was divinely ordained to span the continent, at the expense of the indigenous people who had lived there for centuries. The US President James K. Polk offered $25 million for California and New Mexico, but the Mexican government, fearing a domestic revolution, refused, and tensions grew between these two nations spanning the North American continent. In response to the failed offer, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to move approximately 4,000 troops south of the Nueces River into the disputed territory. By March 1846, Taylor had constructed a fortification, Fort Texas, later Fort Brown, on the banks of the Rio Grande, directly opposite the Mexican city of Matamoros. However, the actual spark of the war occurred on the 25th of April, 1846, when a Mexican cavalry force crossed the Rio Grande and intercepted a patrol of US Dragoons, led by Captain Seth Thornton. In the resultant skirmish, 11 Americans were killed. Upon receiving Taylor's report of the skirmish, President Polk sent a message to Congress declaring that Mexico had invaded US territory and, quote, shed American blood on American soil. Congress officially declared war on the 13th of May, 1846, beginning the Mexican-American War. Intervención estadounidense en México in Spanish. Amidst this escalation, thousands of Irish immigrants were arriving in the United States, escaping the Great Hunger, the famine in Ireland. I talked about the famine in episode 2, so check it out if you haven't already. Between 1845 and 1853, about 1 million people died of hunger, and another million emigrated, mainly to the United States. At this time there was a strong anti-Catholic and Irish sentiment in the US on account of the foundation of the nation by Protestant revolutionaries who were mainly of English ancestry. Following the American Revolution, almost every state constitution, except Virginia, barred Catholics from holding high office. By 1790, Catholics enjoyed equal citizenship in only 5 of the original 13 states. Early colonial charters included penal laws imported from England, such as Maryland's 1704 Act to prevent the growth of popery, which prohibited Catholics from operating schools or instructing children under threat of deportation. In the 1840s, common schools were exclusively Protestant. Conflicts arose when Catholic parents requested their children use a Catholic version of the Bible rather than the King James Version. Nativists viewed this as a popish plot to remove the Bible from schools entirely. The popular press and Protestant missionary societies circulated hundreds of books and pamphlets attacking the evils of popery. Many believed that Catholics were chained to the authority of the Pope, a foreign power, and were therefore incapable of independent thought or loyalty to the United States. Tensions over scoped religious practices erupted into large-scale violence in Philadelphia. Protestant mobs burned 2 Catholic churches, 2 rectories, and a library to the ground, leaving 40 people dead and hundreds of Irish families homeless. As massive waves of Irish and German immigrants arrived in the 1840s, the terms foreigner and Catholic became synonymous in the eyes of many Protestant Americans. In literature, art, and on stage, Irish Catholics were frequently portrayed as ignorant, simian, monkey-like creatures. They were stereotyped as inactive, slothful, and lazy, or possessors of savage ferocity. Within the US military, which many Irish Catholics enlisted in, this discrimination and nativist sentiment was also present. Catholic immigrants were frequently passed over for promotion, regardless of merit, and were disparagingly referred to as mix, potato heads, and ignorant, and were barred from enlisting in elite units such as the engineer companies. They were often subjected to severe physical discipline for minor offences, including the book and gag, and being suspended by their arms from trees. One of the Irish immigrants who witnessed discrimination and outright racism was John Ryal, who was originally from Clifton, County Galway. He was born around 1817, but immigrated to the United States via Canada sometime in 1843. There are persistent but unconfirmed reports that he had previously served as a sergeant in the British Army, specifically the 66th Regiment while stationed in Canada, before deserting to the United States. Regardless of the specific unit, Ryal was recognised by both Mexican and American observers as an expert in heavy artillery, a skill that suggested significant prior professional training. Before enlisting in the American military, Ryal lived on Mackinac Island, Michigan, for approximately 2 years, working as a labourer for Charles M. O'Malley, a local merchant and politician. O'Malley later described Ryal as a troublesome employee who was, quote, always at variance with everyone he had anything to do with, end quote. He joined the US Army on the 4th of September 1845 at Fort Mackinac, Michigan, enlisting as a private, likely out of a desperate need to make a living, which was common for Irish immigrants of that era. He served in Company K of the 5th US Infantry, and shortly after enlisting, he was sent to Texas as part of the Army of Observation. He arrived at the Rio Grande on the 28th of March 1846 and became one of the first soldiers to leave the US ranks. On the 12th of April 1846, before the official declaration of war, he obtained a pass under the pretext of attending a Catholic Mass before crossing the Rio Grande into Matamoros. While he later claimed at his court-martial that he had been kidnapped and coerced into service by the Mexicans, he was quickly commissioned as a lieutenant, and by late April, Ryal had organised approximately 40 other Irishmen who had also left the US ranks into a small artillery unit, initially known as Legion Extranjera, Foreign Legion, or the Red Company. The unit's numbers and identity grew significantly following the Battle of Monterrey in September 1846, which will be discussed in part 2 of the episode, with Ryal and Mexican officials successfully enticing at least 50 more US regular soldiers to desert and join their ranks. Ryal petitioned the Mexican government to allow these men to serve in their own separate unit rather than being dispersed among Mexican divisions, and in October 1846, General Santa Anna officially authorised the unit, which Ryal christened the San Patricios. Ryal created the battalion's distinctive green silk banner featuring the image of St. Patrick, the Harp of Erin, the Shamrock, and the motto Erin go Bragh, Ireland Forever, which had been used by the United Irishmen rebels who organised the 1798 rebellion. By the summer of 1847, the unit had grown beyond a single company as more US deserters and European civilians residing in Mexico City joined the cause. On the 1st of July 1847, Santa Anna ordered the unit's reorganisation into 2 infantry companies of territorial militia, totalling over 200 men. Ryal was promoted to captain and eventually brevet major and lieutenant colonel to lead this expanded force, which remained predominantly Irish but also included Germans, Poles, and other foreign nationalities. Now that we have the context behind Los San Patricios, we'll take a short break before we discuss the battles and engagements of this unit, the executions of some of their members, and their legacy. See you all soon.
están llorando.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were looking at the background to Mexico, the Texas secession and its annexation to the United States, the outbreak of the Mexican-American War, anti-Irish and anti-Catholic discrimination in the US, before talking about the foundation of the Battalion de San Patricio. Now, let's continue the story. The siege of Fort Texas, later renamed Fort Brown, in May 1846, marked the first appearance of American deserters in Mexican uniforms. Under the leadership of John Riley, who was recognised as an expert in heavy artillery, the group operated the cannons that pounded the US fortification from across the Rio Grande. The siege began on May the 3rd and lasted 5 days, with the unit manning batteries located in Matamoros, at a point east of the city, and on the northern bank behind the fort, and General Zachary Taylor specifically reported seeing the deserters behind the artillery pieces that were bombarding his troops. Riley used his professional expertise to organise approximately 48 early deserters into a disciplined artillery arm of the Mexican defence, and while some US historians suggest the deserters remained in Matamoros during the subsequent battles, Mexican evidence indicates that members of the unit also saw action on May the 9th, 1846, at the Battle of Resaca de Guerrero, Resaca de la Palma. However, the first battle where they played an important role was the Battle of Monterrey in September 1846. The deserters were primarily stationed at the Citadel, known in US reports as the Black Fort, a massive fortification that served as the forward artillery position. This position was so effectively defended that the US forces under General Zachary Taylor were unable to capture it during the intense street fighting. The deserters refurbished and manned many of the 32 pieces of artillery guarding Monterrey, and their accurate fire contributed to heavy US casualties. By the end of the first day of Taylor's northeast assault, over 10% of his men lay dead or wounded, largely due to Mexican cannon fire. The San Patricios only relinquished their position at the Citadel as part of the official armistice agreed upon by General Pedro de Ampudia and General Taylor. Upon surrendering the fort, the Irish and Mexican artillerymen held a parade and gave an 8-gun salute to their flag as it was lowered. US observers noted that they marched out of the city with their green silk flag flying and their heads held high, appearing more like a victory parade than a defeated force. While playing a significant role in this battle, the unit would achieve renown at the Battle of Buena Vista, known in Mexico as the Battle of Angostura, in February 1847. Members of the battalion played a critical and highly distinguished role as an elite heavy artillery unit. The Mexican command entrusted the unit with their 3 heaviest and most important cannons, 16-pound guns, though some accounts suggest 18 or 24-pounders, and these guns held a significantly longer range than the smaller field pieces typically used by the Mexican army. Throughout the engagement on the 23rd of February, the unit's fire was described as accurate and deadly, and they successfully decimated the ranks of US engineers and broke up a major charge by the 1st Dragoons, who had been ordered by General Zachary Taylor to, quote, "take those damn guns." In one of the most famous incidents of the battle, the unit's intense fire forced Captain John O'Brien of the 4th US Artillery to retreat, leaving behind 2 6-pounder cannons. These were the first US artillery pieces lost to the enemy during the war, and the San Patricios proudly added them to the Mexican arsenal. While the US line briefly broke, General Santa Anna ordered the unit to struggle up out of a ravine and unlimber their heavy guns in the centre of the plateau to maximise the carnage. The unit fought with such determination that they lost approximately 1/3 of their men, and Mexican records indicate that 1 officer, 2 sergeants, 2 corporals, and 70 privates were killed. The performance of the unit at Buena Vista was highly praised by Mexican generals, who described them as, quote, worthy of the most consummate praise. Following the battle, several members, including John Ryal, were awarded the Angostura Cross of Honor, por valor y sufrimiento, for their bravery, and John Ryal was promoted to a captain, and further promoted to a brevet major by the summer of 1847. Despite these displays of bravery and heroism, the war was not going well for Mexico. California and the modern states of Arizona and New Mexico had been taken by the US, and in March 1847, General Winfield Scott launched the first major amphibious assault in US history in March 1847 at Veracruz, ensuring that by August the US military was advancing on Mexico City. While the battalion was present at the Battle of Cerro Gordo, the 18th of April 1847, the loss of military records owing to the chaotic Mexican retreat makes it difficult to determine what their role was. However, their status as heroes of Mexico will become apparent at the Battle of Churubusco on the 20th of August 1847. Today, Churubusco is part of the metropolis of Mexico City, but in 1847 it was a settlement to the south of the Mexican capital. The battalion was stationed at 2 critical defensive points, a fortified bridge and the San Mateo monastery, often referred to in US accounts as San Pablo. Initially both companies were placed at the Churubusco bridge to protect a battery of 5 cannons, but as the battle intensified and Mexican forces in the monastery began running out of ammunition, one company of San Patricios was moved into the monastery to bolster its defence, while the other remained at the bridge. In the monastery, the San Patricios manned 3 of the fort's 7 cannons, firing with deadly accuracy against the advancing US forces, and they also served as sharpshooters from the monastery's parapets and windows. When a wagon of ammunition finally arrived for the Mexican defenders, it contained US 75 caliber rounds that did not fit in the Mexican muskets. Because the San Patricios carried different weaponry, they were the only unit able to use these cartridges, and allowing them to continue firing long after other Mexican units were exhausted. The San Patricios became famous for their refusal to yield. As the Mexican National Guardsmen realized the situation was hopeless and attempted to raise a white flag of surrender, the San Patricios reportedly tore it down 3 times, continuing the fight with bayonets and rifle butts once their ammunition was spent. Some accounts even claim they killed Mexican soldiers who attempted to display the flag. The battle was the bloodiest of the war for the US Army, a loss often attributed to the skill and desperation of the San Patricio defenders. By the end of the engagement, the battalion was decimated. 35 men were killed in action, including several officers, and 85 were taken prisoner, including their leader, John Ryal. Of the approximately 85 San Patricios captured, 72 were identified as deserters for the US Army and brought before 2 separate military tribunals, Tacubaya, the 23rd of August 1847, and San Angel, the 26th of August 1847. Nearly all of the defenders were found guilty and initially sentenced to death by hanging. General Winfield Scott reviewed the sentences and made several critical modifications based on the Articles of War. Under military law, the death penalty could not be applied to those who had deserted before the official declaration of war in April 1846. Because John Ryal had deserted before the war began, Scott commuted his death sentence to whipping, branding, and hard labour. On the 10th of September, 60 men were hanged at San Angel, followed by 4 more men who were unceremoniously hanged from a tree at Mixcoac on the 11th of September 1847. However, as mentioned before, the largest execution occurred at Mixcoac Hill on the 13th of September under the command of Colonel William Harney, who was notorious for his brutality. Harney forced 30 men to stand with nooses around their necks for hours, refusing to launch them into eternity until the US flag was raised over Chapultepec Castle. Among those hanged was Francis O'Connor, who had lost both legs in battle, and was brought out of a hospital tent on a wagon specifically to be executed. Those whose death sentences were commuted, including John Riley, and they faced lashing, receiving 50 lashes on their bare backs, administered by Mexican muleteers to humiliate them further. Brandon, each was branded with a D for deserter. Riley was branded on the cheek, and when the D first was applied upside down, the executioner was ordered to brand him a second time, correctly. And finally, iron collars. Some were forced to wear heavy iron yokes with long prongs around their necks for the duration of their imprisonment. Following the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which more or less defined the US-Mexican border, apart from changes in Arizona and New Mexico in 1854, following the Gadsden Purchase, the surviving San Patricios were released from US custody on the 1st of June 1848. The Mexican government helped reconstitute the unit, and they served as military police and helped suppress internal revolts, such as the Paredes Jarauta uprising. However, in July 1848, John Riley, who had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, was arrested on suspicion of conspiring with General Paredes to overthrow President Herrera. Believing Riley had been executed, a portion of the battalion attempted to join the rebels. While many were persuaded to return to their quarters, 35 men fled towards Cuautitlan, where they were eventually forced to surrender by Mexican government forces. Although Riley was exonerated and returned to duty, the unit was seen as a potential source of instability, and President Herrera officially dissolved the San Patricio Battalion in August 1848 as part of a post-war budget cut. Riley continued as an infantry officer in Veracruz and later Puebla, though his health began to fail, likely due to a bout of yellow fever contracted in the lowlands. He reportedly wore his hair long during this time to hide the D brand on his cheek. On the 14th of August 1850, he was officially discharged from the Mexican army with the rank of major on full pay for service disability. There has been, however, significant historical debate regarding Riley's final years and death. A death certificate found in the parish church of the Assumption in Veracruz indicates that a 45-year-old Irishman named Juan Riley, or Relly, was buried on the 31st of August 1850. Some sources suggest 1859. The record claims he died of drunkenness without receiving the sacraments, though modern historians note that this cause is suspect, as no autopsy was performed, and Riley had just received a significant $800 discharge payment. A persistent but unsubstantiated story claimed Riley returned to the United States and filed a $50,000 lawsuit against the government in Cincinnati for his illegal branding and flogging. However, court records show no evidence of such a case. Other rumours suggest he married into a wealthy Mexican family and settled down, which some believe explains the continued prevalence of the name Riley in modern Mexican telephone directories. Many San Patricios who were not executed chose to make Mexico their permanent home. These were both Catholic and Irish, and generally assimilated easily into Mexican society, and survivors often married Mexican women and integrated into local communities. In the state of Jalisco, in western Mexico, there is a town called San Patricio, and today families with names like Murphy, Kelly and O'Connor are to be found in cities like Guadalajara and Mexico City, and they still claim kinship with members of the battalion. For those who wish to return to their homelands, the Mexican government provided funds for at least 20 Irish soldiers to secure safe passage back to Europe. In Mexico, the battalion is honoured for its skill and bravery, and for standing with a weaker nation against what is viewed as an unjust invasion. Every 12th of September, a major ceremony is held in the Plaza San Jacinto in San Angel, the site of the first mass executions. Dignitaries, the Irish ambassador and students gather as the names of the fallen are read, with the crowd responding, "Murió por la patria," he died for the country. In 1959, a marble plaque was unveiled in San Angel featuring a Celtic cross embraced by a Mexican eagle, listing 71 names of the, quote, martyrs who gave their lives for the Mexican cause. In 2010, to mark the bicentenary of Mexican independence, a bust of John Riley was dedicated in the same plaza, and a small monument in remembrance to him exists in his birthplace, Clifton, County Galway. In 1960, the Mexican government issued a commemorative medal, and the battalion story is taught in schools, and even included in illustrated history books for children. In the United States, however, opinion of the battalion has been mixed. For much of US history, the San Patricios were relegated to an obscure footnote, often cited by 19th century nativist groups like the Know-Nothings to question the loyalty of Catholic citizens. Some 20th century Irish American historians attempted to downplay the Irishness of the battalion to protect the reputation of the broader Irish immigrant population, who largely remained loyal to the US during the war. However, more recent US scholarship has sought a more balanced perspective, viewing the soldiers through the lens of individual conscience and the systematic discrimination they faced in the US Army. The battalion has been the subject of 5 novels and even a 1998 MGM film, One Man's Hero. In 2010, the Irish group The Chieftains released a tribute CD, and the San Patricio Pipe and Drum Band performs at modern memorial events. Finally, in a 1993 exhibition, the Uruguayan artist Luis Kamnitzer used the battalion's fate to explore themes of persecution and transnational struggle. Before concluding, I would like to tell a personal story. In October 2025, I visited Mexico and travelled to Cholula, Puebla, Oaxaca, and of course, Mexico City. Within the Mexican capital, 2 sites in particular stood out to me: the former monastery at Churubusco and San Jacinto Square. At Churubusco, bullet holes still dot the site of the Los San Patricios' final stand, and their story is told for everyone to see. However, at San Jacinto Square, there are 2 monuments to the memory of the battalion: a plaque listing its members, and a bust of John Riley. As I was scanning the names of the plaque, one name in particular jumped out at me: Keir Delaney. Given that my surname is Delaney, the thought occurred to me that this man could well have been a distant relative of mine, while the inscription beneath the bust contained the Irish words Er Jeisje go raibh a Anam Dílis, meaning, may his soul be at the right hand of God. Both of these surprises really brought home the importance of this battalion, and as an Irishman, I felt I had a tangible connection to this small area in Mexico City, where Irish soldiers are hailed as heroes. While we can question the motivations of some of these soldiers, like the Irish adventurer William Lamport in the previous episode, the fact is that many of them died for a land that was far from home, in a nation that welcomed them. Mexico is important to me for a number of reasons. I have taught many Mexican students, and my visit to the country was a trip that I will never forget. That Irishmen are remembered here, celebrated even, really touched me, and demonstrate more than anything how 2 countries separated by an ocean can be perceived as brothers, as a man in Cholula told me, shows the ties that history weaves between 2 places. The threads that bind 2 peoples through the legacy of Los San Patricios are still strong, nearly 200 years after many of their executions in 1847. And I hope that connections between Ireland and Mexico, the relationship between both of them, continues to remain strong, following in the memory of these men remembered in the small part of Mexico City where I felt at home. That's all for today. The next episode will be the final part of my 5-episode series on Mexican and wider Latin American history, exploring Mexico and the Second World War, the Mexican economic miracle, and the Tlatelolco massacre of 1968, occurring just days before the Olympic Games that will be held in Mexico City. This will be a fascinating episode exploring Mexican history that is not well known outside of Mexico, that in many ways has shaped the country as we know it today. So I hope you can join me again when it is released, and please consider liking the episode subscribing to the History House YouTube channel, following the Spotify and Apple Podcasts accounts of History House, as well as our social media pages on Facebook and Instagram. And until next time, keep her lit.